record this. Everybody get an announcement. Welcome everybody. My name is Nils Andreasen. I'm the Executive Director of the Alaska Municipal League. And welcome to this discussion that really is an opportunity for mayors and partners to think through kind of the state's fiscal policy generally, but very specifically around how the PFD relates to that policy. I want to welcome our group today on the mayor's side, Mayor Bryce Ward, Fairbanks North Star Borough, whose idea this was. And Bryce, I'll turn it to you here in a little bit. Mayor Clay Walker over in Denali Borough, and Michelle DeWitt in Bethel. Hi, Michelle. We have a former mayor, Mike Navarre, who's down on the Kenai, and then some non-mayors. Brad Keithley with having Alaskans for a Sustainable Budget, something like that.
That's good. That's good.
Okay. And Carl Davis is with the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy, ITEP, and he's done a lot of work looking at Alaska over the last number of years. So maybe Bryce, I'll turn it to you now, but remind us kind of what are we trying to accomplish here, and then I'll kind of facilitate things moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Nils, and thanks everyone for being a part of the discussion today. I'll make sure I'm looking at the right screen here. The idea that we had for the panel discussion today was to talk about this issue of the PFD and how it has kind of sucked the oxygen out of the room for a lot of the discussions at the statewide level, and it has broad implications one way or another at the municipal level as well. And oftentimes we hear, we read the newspaper or news articles, we listen to the podcast, we get our data and our information from various different sources, but it's really important to have the dialogue on the pros and cons, on the impacts of these policy decisions for the community, for the state. And so the idea behind the panel today was to be able to dive into some of those issues. It's less debate per se, but more so just discussion wise, right? Like, how do these things impact the community? What are the broader kind of maybe philosophical questions of a permanent fund dividend, of state government, and how those things interact for the future of the state, the future of our communities. So really that was the idea. We've got Carl on for some of that technical expertise to kind of say, hey, this is what this means. We've got folks that kind of maybe could advocate for either side one way or another, or at least have a good understanding of the mechanics of some of the discussions out there, whether it be the POMV or the statutory payout for the permanent fund dividend, and then talk about municipal impacts, statewide impacts. So that was kind of the big idea here. And we're hoping that this is something we can share with our members, that we can share with legislators, and that it can be a place for folks to find that information. So that's kind of, I hope, phrases or at least scopes the topic of discussion for today.
Yeah, thanks, Bryce. And I think, as part of that, we had a quick planning call, some of the mayors and I last week, and this isn't a topic. I mean, I'll be clear that AML has weighed in on, that ACoM Conference of Mayors have weighed in on. There's no argument for should do as part of this. It's really how can we wrestle with this topic that others are wrestling with, and really uncover the issues at stake and the considerations involved, and model the dialogue that we hope to see occur elsewhere. So I hope that will be interesting and helpful. I guess to start out, I mean, I'd love to just kind of get a feel for each of you and how you approach this topic. I guess if I say permanent fund or PFD, like, what's the gut, what's your gut instinct to say in response? It's always fun to figure out who to pick first. But Brad, can I start with you? Because I know you've said a lot over the years about what this means. Can talk about it from your terms as way of an introduction to how you're thinking.
So there's two things that are important to me. Alaska families, the impact on Alaska families, and the impact on the overall Alaska economy. In 2016, ICER, the Institute for Social and Economic Research at University of Alaska Anchorage, did a study of various revenue options, various alternatives for meeting the deficit, for fixing the budget. And their conclusion was cutting the PFD had the largest adverse impact on Alaska families and had the largest adverse impact on the overall Alaska economy of any of the measures. Sales tax, income tax, property tax, any of the measures. Cutting the PFD had the worst impact on Alaska families and on the overall Alaska economy. Carl's study, ITEP's study they did in 2017, demonstrated that cutting the PFD by far had the largest adverse impact on 80% of Alaska families. Raising the raising the revenue through income taxes affected the top 20%, but cutting the PFD was worse for 80% of Alaska families than an income tax. The same is true in some recent work. Carl's concluded the same is true for a sales tax. So if you prioritize, as I do, Alaska families and the overall Alaska economy, cutting the PFD is the worst thing you can do. There are other revenue measures that we can use to fill the budget that are much better.
Great, thanks, Brad. Carl, you were part of that research. What goes into analysis like that? How is it just a numbers thing? And can you talk a little bit about how we should think about that data and the different variables involved?
Yeah, sure. So, we do state tax policy analysis in 50 states, and there's not anything like the PFD in other states. But what I would, the closest parallel where we come at it from is from a tax policy perspective would be something like a head tax, where if you were to levy a flat tax on every family of a set amount of dollars, and what does that look like by income level? This is something we can run through our distributional model. And it's just very clear that if you think of, when I'm approaching it from a state budget perspective, and if the state is looking at PFD reductions or changes in the formula as a means of boosting the revenue side of the picture and being able to cover additional expenses, you would stack that up, say, alongside a sales tax or alongside an income tax as revenue measures that could raise a significant amount of money. And when you put those three side by side, the distribution is just extremely different. So with a PFD cut, the largest impact by far will be for low income families relative to their income. $1,000, $2,000 per family member goes much more noticed for a family close to the poverty line than it does for a family earning 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 or more a year. So it's progressive in that way, in that a PFD change will have a larger impact lower down the income scale. You see that with the sales tax to some extent as well, when you're taxing what people are buying. Low, moderate income people have to spend more of what they earn, and so they tend to pay more in sales tax. And then with an income tax, it's exactly the opposite. Typically under an income tax, there's some base level exemption so that families in poverty aren't having to pay income tax. But then oftentimes you'll actually see a higher tax rate at higher income levels. And so under an income tax, you see just the mirror image of a PFD change, where you see higher amounts relative to income being asked of families. So from a distributional perspective, these are just very, very different options. They can all raise similar amounts of revenue, depending on how you structure these changes, but how Alaska families fare can be very different. Another big consideration, of course, is family size. Under a PFD change, larger families will tend to see a bigger impact on their take-home pay, on their budgets. That's less true, say, with an income tax. But family size considerations are a big factor where PFD change will definitely be felt more by families with children.
So I guess, Brad and Carl, I mean, that's for both of those, that's really, if we think about the PFD relative to other types of revenue. And, you know, Carl, you kind of point to it as kind of it's a reverse head tax right now, right, as a payment. And so you could treat it as a head tax relative to income or sales tax. But Mike, it's not, do you have a different perspective on whether is it revenue, or could we think about it in other terms? And is it an expenditure of the state relative to other expenditures? Or Mike, what are your thoughts on how we should be thinking about this?
Thanks, Nils and Bryce, and thanks to Municipal League and ACoM for I guess having this discussion, because it's critically important. You know, I did a number of presentations when I was mayor of the Kenai Borough, and also when I was commissioner, about the trade-offs in both different revenue streams, but also what's not well understood, I think, by a lot of Alaskans is the impact from budget cuts or not budget increases in certain areas. You know, when you get your assessment notice, you have to show the value of some state funding in terms of the mill equivalency. And in the Kenai Peninsula Borough in 2017, FY17, we had 103 million in basically what are transfer payments from the state government for community assistance, reimbursement of school bond debts, education foundation formula is of course the biggest one, pupil transportation, and the PERS and TERS issue. So, you know, when we talk about capacity for other revenue sources, you know, nobody likes taxes. And I've never met a mayor or municipal official or state official who wanted to raise taxes. What the difference comes down to is what are the priorities that you see in the budget. And so I don't have a problem with a dividend, and it's no surprise to me that studies will show that a cut to the dividend impacts lower income families. But you know, the other thing I hear a lot of talk about is cuts to Medicaid. We need to cut Medicaid. There's two items in the state budget that eat up most of the funds: education and health and social services, primarily the Medicaid program. Medicaid program and public education, particularly in rural Alaska, but also in urban Alaska, also have dramatic and direct impacts on low income Alaskans. We currently have the hold harmless clause when we do the dividend, which is what allows for it to be impact-free distribution of funds. So I guess I'm interested in making sure that we recognize the impacts of state spending on communities. A lot of people, I think, in this state see it as a large bureaucracy, when in fact, those two areas, education and health and social services, most of that money goes out directly to communities in rural Alaska and urban Alaska, pays for teachers, pays for administrators, pays for hospitals, pays for a lot of jobs in the healthcare industry that are also important. So particularly in the Medicaid program, if you state that you try to cut the state's general fund portion, and you can only do that by going inside the formulas and changing them, that is going to have a 2-for-1 negative impact, which really hasn't been assessed in terms of the impacts from something like that versus the impacts from the dividends on poor people and poor families and access to healthcare and public education, and taxes at the local level. You know, the Municipal League and the Conference of Mayors made the point over and over and over again that cuts at the state level directly and negatively impact taxes at the local level. So it's a complex problem. I don't have a problem with a dividend as long as it, I guess, competes with other state services. And I think that if we did not currently have a dividend program with the state's fiscal situation, we wouldn't be discussing implementing a sales tax or an income tax so we could pay a dividend. But in fact, that is part of the trade-off. And so I think having these types of discussions, and as importantly, helping to foster a better understanding about the interrelationships between all of the aspects in an economy that affect economies and that affect people, particularly those of lower income in Alaska. So that's my thoughts.
Thanks, Mike.
Great
And Bryce, I want to say those trade-offs are kind of, we've talked about it in terms of what are constitutional obligations or priorities. What are your thoughts on thinking about the PFD relative to the rest of this?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've heard the governor speak on a couple of concepts and his staff at some of our AML conferences, and so the idea that we have to essentially every year we pass a budget, right, for the state, for our local communities, and that under the premise that we've had in the past is that the PFD kind of seems to be above that, that it is established by statute and therefore should be paid out accordingly. And we've got a number of other obligations throughout the state that are provided in statute, and I think this is where some of the rub comes in from a municipal discussion. Is you've got senior citizen discounts, you've got your farm use exemption discounts that are statutory, that are not paid out. And so how do we balance the need to provide the services that are constitutionally obligated, and yet also we have the permanent fund dividend, which has become a part of our culture, and become part of our I think the difference that makes Alaska different from other states. So I guess one of the kind of on a philosophical level, one of the things that I have a problem with when we look at the state of the state budget is the idea of paying out a dividend and yet still taxing, or that we're taxing ourselves. And so, I'd be interested to know, how we balance the need for services, also the need for revenue at the statewide level to provide for these services, and how the PFD fits into that. It seems a little bit goofy to me that we would pay out a PFD on one side, of maybe equivalency of a tax, like a sales tax, that costs money to the state to implement, that has also an impact on the economy. How do we work through that issue? Because you lose, what is it, 20% of the value of the dividend through payments in taxes to the federal government. So those are some of the things that run through my head, and probably the reason why this conversation's gone on for a decade almost, or more, is how do we balance the need for the services that we have, and then also this thing that we call the permanent fund dividend.
Yeah. Brad, I could imagine there's a couple of things you want to address, but hang on, I'm going to get through everybody. Michelle, what does this mean? What does the PFD mean for folks in Bethel? What does it mean for you and your community, or any response to other comments that come up?
Sure, thanks. Well, the PFD, as we all know, it's important to most Alaskans, but I would say it perhaps plays an outsized role here in rural Alaska, and I'll specifically speak to Bethel. With our cost of living, and with about a quarter, I think, of our community members here living in poverty, and a median household income, it's I think about $55,000 here. A PFD in a household, multiple PFDs and larger households, play a huge difference make a huge impact in the lives of our citizens here. And so much of what was said resonates with me, especially when we talk about more progressive versus regressive, about the impact that a much reduced PFD would have on our lower earning households. I am certainly hearing all of that. And I guess where I sit with this is, every legislative session, I kind of watch the comments on social media and listen to the radio and hear what folks are saying. And I certainly do hear some of that demand for that highest possible PFD cash payout. people need the money. I understand the perspective of that being a citizen share, but the historical role that it's played, and the need for our community members to have this dividend makes me sort of gravitate more towards the need for it to be sustainable, for us to find some sort of middle ground and have a sustainable solution for dividend, and one that is not taking all the air out of the room every legislative session and the focus of every legislative session to the detriment of every other issue that concerns Alaskans. And so back to what Mike said, we talk about the dividend, what it should pay out. We don't frame very well, I think, what the highest possible dividend will cost to Alaskans if we're not funding Medicaid, if our school system, which here is funded by the state of Alaska, is impacted, if we can't fund power cost equalization. So for example, in my household, my average power bill with PCE is around $200 a month. If I get a higher dividend and we don't fund a program like that, I essentially, for one PFD, just paying that right back into the utility company. So I think the conversation is so nuanced, and I think it's not an all or nothing. I think it's an analysis of the state meeting its obligations to Alaskans for safety nets on which they rely, on infrastructure on which they rely, while also trying to make this sustainable payout for folks who also rely now on that. And so it's complicated, I agree. That's kind of where my logic goes about this problem. I tend to personally lean a little bit more towards thinking about instituting an income tax on higher income Alaskans, and getting that a form of revenue in place, and not impacting as little as possible the PFD in that context, because of the regressive nature that simply reducing the PFD to solve budget problems has on our lower income folks. So anyway, that's my look at it. It's my kind of take, and it certainly is a complex issue that has some nuanced communications, some of which I don't think is explained super well to the public.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Clay, this is the third rail, right? We're not supposed to talk about this. Is that?
It's a pretty hot third rail, as we all know. As you know, a pragmatic political observer and participant, one of the first things you think of when you hear PFD is popularity. It's probably one of the most popular, policies that have been implemented, certainly in Alaska, and it'd be hard to find one more popular, I would imagine. And because it helps so many people, back to Mr. Keithley's point of helping so many families. So it does suck all the air out of the room. Come back to the way Bryce formed it up, because it's so popular. And so, yeah, as mayors, as a conference of mayors, we have not come out with a strong statement on that third rail, right? Nobody's been eager to grab a hold of that third rail. But at the same time, we do see the shrinking statewide position and the state not fulfilling its constitutional obligations. We see the impacts within our communities. We see numbers of years now with the state, one of their unconstitutional shrinking positions that's near and dear to me is major school maintenance. Not participating in the funding of our school, construction or maintenance period for years is not tenable, and it's not sustainable. And that's one example. There are others that others have mentioned here as well. So we know what a big portion of outlay the PFD is in the state budget. And so I think it's valuable to have this discussion and to model this dialogue, because I don't have, as a pragmatist who just wants things to work right, but also does want things to be able to get through the political process too. Coming to Bryce's point of, it seems a little goofy, and I've heard this a lot, to pay on one side, to pay a tax while also getting a PFD on the other. I think the Denali Borough has modeled a model of having visitors who often use services within our borough and do hammer on our infrastructure and do require services, having them share in the cost, having them pay taxes that go to the provision of those services and infrastructure. I think the model of implementing a tax which does tap into which does spread the burden to folks who aren't necessarily year-round residents here, whether that be a sales or an income, and they both do that actually, to help sustain that very popular program, is something that I'm interested in talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting to Brad. I mean, you can see maybe from local government perspective, where we kind of look at things that, the connection between the state and municipalities and cities and boroughs. And we can look at, a senior property tax exemption that's been not paid at all, that's in statute and is 0% paid. School bond debt reimbursement that's in statute that's been paid at 0 and 37% and 50%. School construction and major maintenance over the last 20 years it's 8% of need. When I think of 0 and 8 and 37%, like trying to reconcile that with 100, like a fully funded PFD, it's hard to reconcile. How do you view the PFD against other expenditures or obligations of the state?
I view the PFD as a revenue source. To me, the way I think about it is we've got about $1.5 billion deficit, and the question to me is how do you best meet that deficit? There are various revenue sources. Diverting the PFD from its statutory purpose into government is one revenue source. Income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, statewide property tax, other things are revenue sources as well. And to me, then you just stack those up, and what's the best revenue source to meet that deficit? PFDs have the largest adverse impact on the overall Alaska economy. They have the largest adverse impact on Alaska families. And it's not just lower income Alaska families. If you compare the PFD as a revenue source to an income tax or to a sales tax, middle income Alaska families, even upper middle income Alaska families are losing more dollars through PFD cuts than they are through providing those revenues through income taxes or sales taxes. So it's not just a lower income thing; it's a middle income thing. Middle income of importance to middle income families as well. So I understand the spending side. I understand that we need to spend. I used to, but I don't anymore advocate cuts in Medicaid. I used to, but I don't anymore advocate cuts in the university system. I accept that we're going to spend a certain amount. The question is, what's the best way to fund that spending? And the 2016 ISA report, Carl's 2017 report, all tell you that the worst way to fund that spending, to fund the deficit, is to cut the PFD. It has the largest adverse impact on Alaska families and on the Alaska economy. So, I mean, I don't understand why we think about cutting the PFD first when it has the worst impact of all of the possible revenue sources. I understand it's tough to raise revenue, But keep in mind that you're taking revenue out of the hands, you're taking income out of the hands of middle and lower income Alaska families when you cut the PFD. It's just like a tax. You're taking those dollars out of their hands. So the question to me should be, what's the best way to raise that revenue, regardless of what the spending is, and accepting that we need to comply with current law in all ways, Medicaid, local government, university, in all ways. But what's the best revenue source to meet that?
I mean, the fact that there's a conversation about the PFD as revenue and a conversation about the PFD as expenditure makes this a very difficult conversation, because it's because you can't maybe have it both ways, or you can, but it makes it squirrely. I mean, to the point that I mean, you add an income or a sales tax to be able to pay for the PFD. That's the worst revenue choice, but an expenditure.
But you're not. But you're not. The PFD isn't the marginal source of money. I mean, Senator Hoffman on the Senate floor when the budget bill came up said the original intent of the PFD was it's the first dollar paid, and then we pay for government. And
out of the permanent fund.
Out of the permanent fund. And if you need to raise taxes, if you need to raise revenues, then that's what taxes are going to. They're going to fund government. The argument that the PFD is the last dollar, that somehow you're raising taxes to pay for the PFD, it's just, I think it's wrong. I think it's got it backwards. Usually
taxes pay for government.
Yeah, taxes pay for government. The PFD is, in Governor Hammond's vision, is a sharing of the state's resource wealth. It's free. It's free money to whoever uses it. It's free either to the state or to the individuals. And the question that Hammond faced, questions the legislature faced in '82, was what's the best use of it? And the decision then was the best use of it was to split it equally between government and the citizens, and set those two sides apart. Now we're arguing that somehow it's become spending when it's always, and it was intended from the outset, as just revenue to individuals.
Yeah, Mike.
Actually, the first iteration of the permanent fund was a grand experiment in taking a non-renewable resource and saving a portion of it for future generations to help pay for the cost of government when we saw the inevitable decline in permanent fund. There's some charts that are in the historical documents that show the crossover when we were going to see revenues decline and expenditures climb, and where that crossover point was, where we would need those earnings of the permanent fund. And it was fabulously successful. In 1980 was when the dividend came about. It didn't get paid until 82 because of litigation, and that was at least in part to, I guess, make sure that people were paying attention to the management of the permanent fund, so the permanent fund wouldn't be spent over time. And we've done a really good job of it. But the dividend has, without question, positively affected our economy, and it positively affects individual families, particularly poor people. But I still think what we're ignoring is the original purpose of the permanent fund was to set some money aside, and then a policy decision was made to share a part of it as our resource wealth. There's lots of arguments about why the permanent fund should be paid up, and there's lots of misunderstandings about it too, but that's because people have different opinions and perspectives on it. I think that we have to get past this hurdle. I think that we're going to be paying a permanent fund dividend. I'm okay with that, even with the advent of taxes. I think what you have to do is figure out what that number is going to be, build a broad consensus around that, so that the rational elected officials will be able to have enough, backbone to agree that we're going to limit the dividend to this amount. And then once we could get past that, and I'm not going to suggest an amount, but once we get past that, then we can focus on taxes for government, because you can't ignore the fact that we already have the hold harmless in the permanent fund dividend program. That also benefits the lowest income people, those on Medicaid or other public assistance. So I guess I think we, as in general, the public in general doesn't have a good grasp of the interrelationships, and that needs to be explained, I guess, collectively, instead of, because we're going to get pulled in all different directions. Doesn't matter what the consensus comes to. There are still going to be people who are going to say it should be a full statutory dividend. We should, we could use our money better than the government. In fact, those are arguments that aren't really true. I mean, if you look at rural airports, you look at the ferry system, none of those things are going to be a group of people coming together and provide that service. That's what government does. We've gotten to the point where we don't really recognize, and I know municipal officials do, you know, the good that government does and the reasons why we have governments and why we provide government services. And clearly, the permanent fund dividend is a spending, in my opinion, it's a spending item, not a revenue item. We spend it every year.
Yeah, Bryce, I mean, can we think about, can we think about them at the same time and be comfortable with that? Can they be an expense? Can the PFD be both an expense and a revenue? And can we compartmentalize what taxes pay for? Can we think about an income or a sales tax as paying for something that's not a regular payment of the PFD? Or is it really necessary to put everything into the same bucket and imagine that that a new tax is paying for that other expenditure? Can we split those things apart like that, or does it just make it squirrely?
Yeah, you know, from my accounting background in business, I have a hard time seeing, on the balance sheet, an item being a revenue and expenditure. You have different sheets for that. I mean, it can be true, but it's how you're accounting for it. So I think for the policy level discussion, I mean, I see two really big issues here that really are being played out or warred out here. Is you have this idea of is the PFD an expenditure or is it a revenue? And then is it above all other expenses, or is it on the same playing field? So is it more important than education funding or Medicaid or fill in the blanks, or is it equal? Should it be in the whole swath with everything else that's budgeted for every year? And I think until we really nail down at least a fundamental understanding of what the PFD is in regards to that, it's going to be really hard to find a compromise. So, it either is more important than the other things, or it is as important as the other things. I think that's going to be a really important thing for us to flesh out. Some of the concerns that I have when we look at the future, I mean, I grew up, I'm born and raised here in the interior. PFD has always been a big part of our lives. It helped our family growing up. Mom and dad said, hey, we're going to use this to pay for fuel. We're going to use it to pay for taxes. I remember one year we would go down to Anchorage for Thanksgiving to see my granddad. And I got to use some of the PFD money to buy my first hatchet, which I proceeded to cut lots of trees down with. But that was my kind of the first moment I had of like, okay, there's this thing called the PFD and we get money for it. But I think it's really important for us to think about this in a long-term perspective too. And that's where I get really nervous when I hear discussions on like constitutional obligations and the idea of the government guaranteeing a payout. And again, it's how you view it. Is it as important or is it more important as other services? Kind of scares me from a more maybe conservative perspective. I find that a little bit frightening, I guess, just to be completely honest. A question I have for Carl in regards to all this, and I'll hopefully tie it back into the overall conversation, is we talked a lot about dollars and impact to the economy. Is every dollar the same? So is a PFD dollar the same as a tax dollar, or the same as if it's revenue expenditure, is a dollar the same across the board? I guess I'm curious from an economics perspective how that works out.
Sure. Yeah. It's an interesting question. I mean, returning to this idea, if you're trying to generate a significant amount of revenue and you put a tax dollar, say, alongside the PFD, under any of those options, one thing you want to look at is how many of those dollars are actually coming out of Alaskans' pockets versus coming from a different source. And I think under every option, you're going to see some leakage. So say, for example, you cut back the PFD, most of that is going to be coming out of Alaskans' pockets, but a share of it will come from the federal government because federal tax bills come down if you have less income, and the PFD is counted as a source of income by the federal government. The same is true under tax options, though, right? If you implement an income tax, you'll be able to raise a slice of that money. Won't actually come out of Alaskans' pockets; it'll come out of seasonal workers or non-resident workers, or same with the sales tax. A slice of that would come from visitors and tourists. So I think there's a commonality among all the options there. The other thing you can look at is what is the impact on, say, spending within a state, especially maybe in a rural area where a lot of spending and consumer behaviors is really, driven by the PFD, like you're in your example, being able to buy that hatchet. That hatchet goes unpurchased because there was no PFD there, then that's less economic activity. And so that can have an economic effect as well. And so when you look at a regressive versus a progressive source, with these regressive changes, that's expected to have the largest impact on consumer spending power, because that's money. If you're taking money out of low, moderate income, even middle income families' pockets, it's money that's more likely to be spent. Whereas with a high income family, they may be doing less saving. They'll do less setting aside for the future, for investing. And in a lot of cases, they may maybe a smaller investment in the stock market, for example, that goes undone because they had to pay a bit of tax. So those are the different ways. But how would the money have been used if it have been available to Alaskans or not? There's a difference there. Returning to this big picture question of is this a revenue item? Is this an expenditure item? I think that's a really interesting philosophical discussion. I think Brad's point about the practical impact on a lot of families, what's it going to mean for my wallet, is probably at more top of mind for a lot of folks. And I think he is right that under especially in the income tax versus PFD change comparison, it really is very clear, both in our data and in ICER's data, that the PFD change will have a larger impact, not just for low income families, but for most families. So if Alaskans were presented with these two options side by side and had to pick one just solely based on their own self-interest, the income tax would be the more appealing option to most families. And I think what you're trying to do in this situation, Alaska really is an exceptional state, but in some ways, this debate is Alaska inching a little bit closer to being more like every other state and having to confront these really, really challenging, really intense budget trade-off debates. Or are we going to provide more heating assistance or more Medicaid dollars? Or are we going to raise the sales tax or an income tax? What is the least painful option we can do if we can't just count on oil revenue to keep our budget balanced anymore? And trying to find that least painful option all at once, not framing it up as one discussion of Medicaid versus PFD or income tax versus PFD, and looking at the big picture and say what's the least painful, where are the fewest trade-offs involved. It really is. It's the way that these debates happen in every other state, and I think like I said, I think it's maybe Alaska's budget debate starting to look a little bit, just ever so slightly, a little bit more like other states' debates.
I wonder from Denali Borough, I know that, your tax structure it's entirely, right, almost entirely bed tax. So and there's a few others who are similarly looking at it's not all broad-based taxes, and bed tax falls on visitors mostly. So, we've got a good example of a municipality that's focused on other people's activity, right, within the borough jurisdiction. I guess the comparison, or like bringing it back to the PFD versus that type of revenue, is bed tax doesn't fall much at all on your residents. How do you have that conversation within the borough about who's taxed within the borough?
Yeah, thanks. We had that discussion a bit as I proposed other taxes that that both residents and visitors would pay, and folks at the ballot box did actually approve that tax in November of 19. Granted, we understand that the visitors would pay the lion's share of the new alcohol and marijuana tax that was implemented this January, but we did have a little bit of that discussion, right? A little step forward in that discussion, and some borough residents recognize that they'd pay and make some contributions to their local government for their first time ever by some purchases within the borough. And so, I'd say we're a little bit of an outlier there in terms of the local contribution has been weighted heavily towards non-residents. And honestly, our experience through the pandemic has been that it's not the greatest sustainable model in terms of a solid financial footing where when you have all your eggs in one basket. So that basket fell apart and we've experienced profound difficulties. So, I think a wide base is one certainly lesson that we've learned, a wider base, but at the same time, one that Alaskans recognize that they recognize the amount of seasonality that we have here. And granted, Denali Borough is maybe more strongly seasonal than other places, but every place in Alaska has its fair share of seasonality.
Right. Yeah, no, thanks. I know that we interviewed a couple state tax directors earlier in the year, and almost all the other states kind of focused on this blended approach, right? It's multiple forms of taxation so that burden falls on different groups of residents or companies or others. And I mean, a PFD only approach to that reduction seems like it only falls on one group of people and more heavily on one than others. So if we're just thinking about it in terms of revenues, it's a useful way to think about it. Who pays? How much do they pay relative to income? Where are they located? That geographic representation. So I think that's important as a revenue side of things. Bryce, did you have another either follow-up or question or comment?
Yeah, so I'm looking at this as to what makes us special. And so I think, Carl, you bring a great perspective. Oftentimes as Alaskans, I feel like we think the rest of the world thinks like we do, and that's really not the case. But when we think of this discussion about the PFD and about a state where the residents, the state collectively owns the subsurface rights, really, I mean, that's the thing that makes us different, right? I mean, other states aren't having PFD discussions because they don't necessarily have that interest. It goes to the landowners individually. So with that kind of premise, really what allows us to have this conversation is the royalty stake or the owner interest stake in the resources. So I guess I'm curious, and for someone maybe that knows a little bit more history than I do, is like, how much of a conversation was that a part of the original PFD discussions? And like, I mean, I've heard it in the conversations I hear nowadays of, it's our resources, we own it, it should be coming back to Alaskans. So I guess I'm interested in the historical perspective, and then how that ties back to the policy discussions now is, I see a disconnect between the royalty stake that we have as Alaskans and the PFD payout, and really what is like the earnings on that money, which is what we're talking about. So for me, maybe there's a correlation there I'm not thinking of. And then maybe there's a different way for us to think about this if we truly tied it back to the royalty earnings that we get as a state. And maybe that would help us think about development in a different way too. I'm just throwing an idea out there with a question.
Carl or maybe Brad, can either of you kind of speak to that?
Well, I'll try one brief. There's a concept in resource law called the resource curse, and the resource curse is when the government owns the resource. Like, let's pick Angola just for example. Angola owns the resource, or Equatorial Guinea owns the resource, and the government controls all of it. The curse is that there tends to be a lot of money spent very quickly, but there tends to be a lot of graft, greed, and corruption as a result of it. People seeing that money and sort of directing it into programs they like, or programs that benefit them, or programs that are state-driven, decided by the state. The solution to the resource curse, and Governor Hammond talks a lot about this, and you can find a lot of discussion of it in Norway too. The solution to the resource curse is to have a broader distribution of the resource, the benefits of the resource. Governor Hammond at one point talked about mimicking what goes on in the lower 48, where a portion of the benefits of the resource go to the individual in terms of the landowner or the royalty owner, and then a portion of that comes to the state through taxes. And by getting a portion of it out of the hands of the government, you have a better distribution, a better use of the funds, a healthier economy, a healthier populace, because everybody's sharing in it, as opposed to it going to just a given segment of this decided by government. Hopefully that's responsive, Bryce.
Yeah, I mean, I guess building on that a little bit, I know less about the detail on the history, but philosophically, I mean, I can see a consistency in paying out a PFD as a sharing of resource wealth, which, you know, seems to be part of the legislative history there and the purpose for this. And then at the same time, having taxes that fund government to, you know, confer on people a taxpayer status, or contribute, you know, and creating, you know, the phrase that's often used is skin in the game. They're making a contribution. They're more invested in what the outcomes are. So they're in somewhat on a little bit different tracks. There is I don't think there's an inconsistency there in doing both.
I wonder, one of the stats that I kind of found interesting over the last few months has been how much was required by the Constitution for the legislature to put into the permanent fund. And actually, out of the total funds that have been appropriated into the permanent fund, only 33% was constitutionally required. Does that make any difference in terms of how we think about the PFD distribution if all the rest of what's gone in has maybe gone to Mike's point about saving for like this future Alaska where that non-renewable resource is no longer available? Does that change how we think about things at all? Let me ask, I don't know, Mike or Michelle, any thoughts on that?
I have thoughts on pretty much everything, Nils.
I know, that's what makes 7 hard.
You know, you're correct. You know, we hear a lot about, when we hear a tax on government, you know, we hear, well, don't give it to the government, they'll just spend it all, we can spend it better than they do, et cetera, et cetera. Reality is that was dedicated to the permanent fund constitutionally, meaning from royalties and taxes that rents and royalties, leases that go into the permanent fund constitutionally. The legislature over time actually has been very responsible. We did not have a POMB, but we did inflation proof the fund over time, and that's a significant portion of what's currently in the fund. Additionally, when the legislature, I think on at least 3 different occasions, maybe more, when there were excess revenues, the legislature appropriated funds into the corpus of the permanent fund in order to protect it. The language in the Constitution for the permanent fund is fairly simple. It doesn't say for the dividend. For the permanent fund, it doesn't say a portion of this shall be used for a dividend, or that's the purpose of it. It says these funds accrue to the general fund unless otherwise authorized by law. That's paraphrasing it, but that's pretty much what it says. So it makes the permanent fund earnings a revenue source. The dividend is an expenditure of those revenues. how we reconcile that, man, is up to us, and it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah. Michelle, any thoughts on that, or just to the purpose of the permanent fund? I mean, I've heard this, it's for a rainy day, and we could probably all talk a lot about that, but what would that mean to you, or how should we think about what's gone in and what should come out?
Well, I go back to my previous comments of sustainability. I'm interested in the history of the PFD and what was intended, and I've heard the different debates of what people meant and what the intentions were of the PFD over the last couple of decades. But the reality that we have is now we have families relying on that dividend, and we know the impact it has on those households, and we know the impact it has on our economy for that PFD dividend spending. And so we're now in a situation where we, regardless of what was intended or not intended, where Alaskans are very motivated around the PFD. It is very popular. It does have impact. And so I just go back to the sustainability piece. What's the sustainable number that we can pay out and have a positive impact on Alaskan families as a portion of the sharing of this enormous wealth our state has, but not to the total sacrifice of every other safety net Alaskans needing, not to the sacrifice of public education. So I'm all about the middle ground on this and finding some compromise. I really think that's where our solutions are. It's my perspective. I don't think everyone's going to get everything they want. Folks who want, their $4,000 dividend, or people who think that should be totally sacrificed and fully fund state government. I don't think either of those are a total solution. I think we're going to have to come together and figure out, where do we do the least harm here and where do we do the most good.
And I feel like that's the right note to end on, you guys, though I really want to talk more about this. Let's use that as a placeholder ending. We'll do one more kind of round of closing thoughts, but if you would build on Michelle's closing thought, that'd be great. Carl, you're furthest away. Let's start with you. Closing thoughts on how we should be thinking or working toward some resolution on this.
Yeah, on the idea of trying to maybe bridge disparate points of view here. I saw some of that in, say, in former Governor Bill Walker's plan, for example, where it was a pairing of PFD changes, which is widely acknowledged to more impact low-income families, with a progressive income tax that would ask more of high-income families. You put those two things together, you end up with something in the middle. It wasn't, when we ran the numbers, it wasn't exactly proportional. It wasn't exactly asking the same contribution from everyone, but the ingredients were there to say, create something proportional if you wanted to. So, I think that when you combine, it's interesting, you can combine two things with such disparate impacts, and you do end up with something somewhere in the middle if you do that.
Yeah. Clay, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think this has been a really good conversation. I appreciate the dialogue and bringing us together. I do think about the political realities. I was just harking back to a comment by the previous Senate president that the Senate was the only thing standing in the way of Alaskans and an income tax, and that might still be the position today. So I think we need to not that I'm championing an income tax. It's just that when we talk about these different things on the table and different mechanisms and levers, I think it's important that we all think about what's possible as well. So so I'm interested in continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Clay. Brad, we haven't even talked about flat tax, but any final, let's throw everything in here. No, other thoughts from you, Brad, as we wrap up?
Well, the flat tax is an approach to take an equal amount from the same amount as a share of income from all Alaska families. Everybody has the same skin in the game. Everybody has the same incentive to look out at spending. And that relates to the PFD, because to me, the PFD just shoves the burden. It's the top 20% saying we don't want to pay. If you look at the distribution chart, it goes like this. The top 20% is down here, contributing a very small percent of their income. The lower end's up here, a very high percent of their income. The middle income is contributing less than the lower end, but much higher than the upper end. And the PFD is just a way for the wealthiest 20% of Alaskans to say, we're going to shove the burden to middle and lower income Alaska families to take care of government. And I think that's the wrong approach. A flat tax to me is the right approach because it evens the burden across all Alaska families. I think about it in terms of impact on Alaska families, impact on the overall economy. PFD's worst, the worst impact of any of the revenue options or any of the options on those two, and we ought to find a better way.
Thanks, Brad. Mike?
Well, I think looking back at history, my guess is that most people in Alaska weren't here in 1976 or weren't old enough to vote to establish the permanent fund. And I think that while history is very important, everybody in Alaska now pretty much understands the permanent fund dividend and the direct impact to them. And I share the concern that the impact is manifest mostly with lower income Alaskans, and particularly lower income Alaskans with big families. There's a lot of nuances to this discussion and debate. I think that the middle ground somewhere makes the most sense. I don't have a bit of problem with a flat tax, depending on how you index it. And I know there's different discussions about that, Brad. I'd love to talk to you in more detail about some of those ideas. So I think that am I looking at it as a spending decision? If we paid the statutory dividend, it would far eclipse education and health and social services in terms of expenditures for the state of Alaska. And I don't think that makes sense. And I also think that the higher the dividend, the more pressure it puts on budget cuts, which have as direct negative impact, not necessarily on everyone, but if you cut the Medicaid program and people lose their jobs, the dividend pales by comparison to the fact that they had a job in the healthcare industry. So I think that having a dividend and the capacity for people to accept a dividend and pay taxes is something that we have to strike that balance. And it doesn't mean that a higher dividend couldn't be paid. The reality is it probably wouldn't, because it would then end up being an offset against taxes. So higher dividend means higher taxes, et cetera. So I'm concerned about the pressure on expenditures, state government expenditures. The higher the dividend gets, the more that budget cuts are impacted, and that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I like that. I don't know, this middle, I don't know about middle ground or compromise, but working toward kind of a common sense solution does have us at least evaluate the PFD next to the right buckets, right? The PFD relative to other types of revenue and PFD relative to other types of expenditures. And you have to do both analyses so that you can really understand those distributional impacts. Bryce, I'm closing with you. I kind of went around my screen and landed with you in the middle. Also, you're the host technically of this event, so send us home.
Thanks, Nils. I really would just like to say thank you to everyone for being a part of this discussion today in this panel. I think there was a quote, and I might not get it exactly right. It's the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And it seems like in regards to the PFD discussion, there's so many nuances, I think is the word we used in the panel today, in areas that it impacts and affects our economies and our communities, that I think really warrants a lot more of these types of conversations. And so I'm really encouraged by the discussion we've had today. I do think, we've said it quite a bit, that there needs to be some sort of a compromise, and that, our ability to move forward as a state is really, I think, the success that we will have or not have is going to determine on how we choose to settle this issue. I was born and raised here in Alaska. I've got 2 little boys that I hope will also fall in love with Alaska as I have. And I hope that we can build a state that will support them in that, so that they can explore the opportunities in front of them, whether it be through different occupations or educations or families or whatever it may be. So I don't have an answer for the discussion of what should we do, but I know that there's lots of things that we need to take into consideration, and I know that we're going to get there as a state. We have to. And I'm encouraged that we've got folks like you all in the room today that are willing to have that conversation.
Thanks, Bryce. Thanks to everybody who joined us as panelists. Thanks to everybody online. We'll make sure to share this conversation with our membership and beyond. And hopefully it informs continued dialogue around this issue. So thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.